Hello, everybody, and welcome to the RFP Success Show. I am your host, Lisa Rehurick, the #1 sought-after authority on RFP success. And every week we bring you information, strategy, and resources to help you win more business through RFPs and hopefully have a little bit of fun doing it. So let's go ahead and get this week's episode started. Today I'm joined by Richard Goring, and he's a director at BrightCarbon, a specialist presentation and e-learning agency. So Richard, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's a delight to be here.
We're going to learn a lot of fun stuff from Richard today because he is a graphic guru, and I've had the pleasure of moderating a panel with him at the APMP conference this past year, and he is a wealth of information. So you want to get out a pen and paper and be ready to take a lot of notes because we're talking about visuals. You can't see anything, but we're going to be talking about a whole lot of options for things that y'all can do. So Richard, let's just kick it off by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what it is you do.
Sure. So, as you said, I work for BrightCarbon. We're a specialist presentation agency. We do e-learning as well. Essentially, it's all about visual storytelling techniques. So we're using those to create presentations, infographics, animations, trainee e-learning, that kind of thing for our clients. And the common element across all of it is really using visuals to convey information. So that's what we thought we'd talk about today.
Wonderful. And yeah, I love this topic because, we review a lot of RFPs and we see a lot of really bad graphics. And we see graphics just used in the wrong way. So when you talk about storytelling, because that's such a big thing, right? I'd like you to talk about the power of visuals to support the storytelling aspect of a proposal. Can you share your thoughts on, I know that's a big question, but can you share your thoughts on why storytelling and what does that even mean?
Sure. Yeah. I think you're right. Visuals are such a big part of proposals, but often actually they're an afterthought. You think about it, it's kind of, if people think about graphics at all, they are the supplemental ones. It's the title page image, the flourishes around the design that kind of desperately try to make something nice of a wall of text, make it look less boring. Maybe the logo placement, stuff like that. Those are the kinds of things the branding department look at regularly.
Yes.
The problem is that whilst they're important for professionalism, let's not kind of do it a disservice, they often don't add any value in terms of the story you're trying to tell and the content. So if you think about when you're scanning a document, for example, you're probably drawn to any kind of diagram that's there first, and it's usually going to be some kind of graph or chart, and maybe too much, but that's the most interesting thing. And so if you're looking at kind of, visuals, they're the most interesting part of documents. They form the basis of websites. Everyone's heard of death by PowerPoint in the presentation world. And so people know that really there's something better out there, which is often kind of visuals. And the reason that I think visuals work is because they have this great ability to convey really complex information in a very elegant way. And I like that kind of terminology, this idea of elegantly conveying information. It's not about dumbing things down, so you're doing really complex proposals for people. You can't get rid of the content, but you can often elegantly convey a lot of that information using a visual, using an infographic, using some kind of diagram or chart. And a visual, and the way that I'm describing them, doesn't need to be just a picture or a photo, because again, that's largely going to be window dressing. It's about actually conveying real information. And not only does it do that, but also it can really set things off as well. So it can give you a huge edge compared to a tome of text that most people will put forward in a lot of proposals, because it breaks things down, it's easier for people to engage with, it helps people to understand, and it helps people to remember the things that you're telling them. So if you can embed into your graphics, into your visuals, the reasons why they should choose your proposal as opposed to anybody else, what the benefits are of this, or how it works and how it's better than anything else, well, that's going to be great, because when they're making their decision over which supplier to go with, which will be a couple of days, sometimes weeks later, they're much more likely to be able to remember a lot of that content as opposed to anything else that they'd read in kind of large swathes of text as well. So the ability to remember and recall information is again, a key reason why visuals and infographics and things are so important as part of a proposal.
I love that. And I know there's a statistic out there, I don't know if you know it, but isn't there something about how we retain information so much better at a much higher percentage when it's visual versus when we're reading it?
Yeah, and there's loads of different studies on this, but in general, you'll find that people will say it's around about 10% of stuff that you read, 20% of stuff that you hear, you'll remember and retain, but around about 60 to 70% of stuff that you'll be able to see, you'll be able to
Wow.
retain. There's also, there's all sorts of caveats to it about context and relevance and stuff
Yeah.
like that as well. So, don't take those single stats as being kind of glib trite things. They are. There's a lot of kind of nuance to it, but in general, it gives you a good viewpoint of the fact that visuals are really good. I mean, I think we'll probably get into this a little later, but you've also got to remember that just a visual on its own doesn't necessarily work. It needs the
Right.
explanation, detail. It's all about these things working together. You can't just have a single page infographic as a proposal if you're, pitching to build a nuclear power plant, for example. I mean, let's be serious, but it's about combining all of these different things. So you've got a real multimedia experience for your audience going on. And so visuals are a really easy way, but also a very powerful and compelling way to get your audience to engage with your content.
Well, that's a really great segue into the conversation about what you should and shouldn't use visuals for and what kind of information can you convey through visuals. Because like I said, and you and I talked about this right before we went live, is that there's a lot of bad visuals out there. People just plop them in because they think they need to have something. But if it's not telling them anything worthwhile, then it's all for naught. So
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the things that people should be using visuals for? What kind of information should they be conveying?
So, I mean, the key thing with a visual is what is it going to help you to achieve? So often it's a question of, right, we've got a very complex kind of technical solution for something. Often that's going to be far better represented visually than it is going to be in written prose. Often you get your subject matter experts and they will maybe give you a diagram, they'll give you a process flow, they'll give you a technical map of something actually happening, and then either their job or your job is to convert that into text that you then put in the proposal. And you think, why are you doing that? You're now taking it out of a natural form
Right.
so that people can actually understand it. You think about kind of maps and diagrams and site layouts and things like that. And again, you can't really describe where things are going to go. So if you're pitching a warehousing solution and kind of how that's going to be kind of worked and stuff, again, that doesn't really work that well. And then you've also got elements that just kind of make it engaging for people as well. So help them to understand what you're talking about. So maybe in the lead up to your proposal, to your solution, you might want to give people images of the solutions that you're putting in place. So if you're putting in kind of new equipment, new machinery, maybe that's useful to help them understand, or maybe do an annotated diagram or something so that they can understand how what you're proposing is different, maybe highlight the different portions of it. So it's really all context dependent. It depends very much on the story you want to tell, the level of the audience, the kind of the content that you have to convey. But all of those things I think are going to be really useful to just break up the content a little bit more, probably be able to convey the content in a much more natural, as I said, much more elegant and much easier to understand way as well, rather than just having lots of text.
So it sounds like you got to be a little more proactive, right? You can't just plop them in as an afterthought, as you and I both know that so many people do. And you've got to be really proactive about thinking what you want those visuals to convey as the end result. What should you not communicate via visuals?
Well, so, I mean, Lisa, how many times have you seen in a proposal someone has got a chart in there? Because that's the most common visual you see.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And how many times can you read the chart?
Yeah. Very, very few.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't happen. So one or two things is going to happen. Either the finance guys or the tech guys or something have pulled together a chart from Excel. This is, from the database that we've got. And so inevitably people will put that in because it's the only graphic that I've got.
Yeah.
Or they will go to a third party kind of report or something, and you'll be able to take the chart out of that. And no consideration is given to what are we trying to do with it. It's just this chart vaguely relates to the information we're trying to get across. And that's a key problem, because often people will try to put in these things. I mean, let's set aside for a moment the pretty graphics, because again, they have a place to make things look professional, but I don't consider them necessary to be storytelling.
Right.
So they're, but not useful all the time. So the things like charts that I've described are probably the worst offenders, because now what you've got is a situation where you've got a diagram in there, a chart that looks like it should be adding a lot of value. because there is a lot of information there, but it
Right.
doesn't necessarily pertain to the story that you want to convey. And so that's a real problem. So, the
Mm.
information that you may want may be in there, but it may be a part of it, or it may be all of it. But what you fail to do is to give the trend or the meaning or the kind of the inferred information or the implied information from it. So you need to look at any kind of graphic you're putting in and saying, what is this trying to do? What is the content that needs to be in there? Is there anything I can get rid of? So again, we go back to that idea of elegant kind of infographics, but also what is the punchline? So what is it that you want people to be able to get directly from that? And sometimes that could be a text label, like a huge kind of big text label to talk about, 64% improvement or whatever that happens to be. Or it might be that you're highlighting portions of it, or it might be that you're cutting down a lot of the content. So I think putting in graphics, often complex ones, without any thought about the story and how people will interpret it, because they're not subject matter experts like you, that's
Right.
probably the biggest mistake that people make with graphics and proposals.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things that I see a lot too is call out boxes
Hmm.
because, I do deal with a lot of government proposals. And so you don't want it to have so many bells and whistles, but let's put some call out boxes in here to make it visually appealing. But then they'll put something in there like, we were founded in 1977. And I'm like, who cares? Nobody cares about that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So those
Yeah. And
call out
so,
boxes can be kind of crazy too.
yeah. But again, used in the right circumstance, they can be really useful because they draw
Yes.
the eye to something. But as you say, it's exactly that question of, oh, I've got something here that could be interesting, but you fail to make that final connection, that final step of, and let's actually make it kind of relevant and useful to people. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, that's so interesting. So, um, w- you know, there's a lot of different people listening to this podcast that do corporate proposals that, okay, when we do corporate proposals, we can go all out and get really graphically heavy and really put a lot of bells and whistles in and make sure that there's a lot of visuals to tell a story. But then on the government side of things, you've got to be pretty tame with all of that.
Mhm.
How do you well, let's start with the government side of things. What kind of visuals do you think that people should be including in, say, a government proposal where it's got to be more minimal versus a corporate that can be a lot more prettied up?
So I think you're right. Kind of in the government world, and just people shy away from anything that isn't kind of Times New Roman or Courier New kind of font, and it looks like it's been on a typewriter, because that's what we started doing in the 50s, and that's what we're going to continue to do forever. And
Ugh.
that creates a problem, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. What you probably can't get away with, because of all the systems you have to upload it into, is lots of kind of flashy graphics, but a simple JPEG is not a problem to embed into a document. And so at
Mm.
that point, it's thinking, okay, what is a single graphic that I can create? And when I'm talking about a JPEG, that's kind of the picture file format type that's going to be fairly ubiquitous. That doesn't have to be a photo you take with your camera or your phone. That could be any diagram. So you could open, for example, PowerPoint. You can create a flow map diagram across a slide. Make it reasonably large, because remember, it's going to be shrunk down onto a page in a system that people can look at. Or you can create a chart, again, in Excel or in PowerPoint, and you can simply then save that chart or save that slide as a JPEG file, as a picture file, and then you can embed it. And so I think things like that are going to be really useful. Now, if you think about those scenarios where you've got a fairly limited window for your graphic, you can't have too much in it. So you might want to have the call out box type technique, where you
Mm.
have maybe a high level view of a graphic. Maybe it's going to be a system process or a site map or something. And then maybe you've got just a little kind of highlight box around it. And the second graphic you produce just underneath it is then going to be the blow up of that. There are nicer, kind of cleaner ways that you can do that in something that's a bit more kind of complex or in depth, but you don't need to do that. There is a level of simplicity there, which in itself is quite elegant. So
Yep.
you can start to do those relatively simple things, but what it requires you as the proposal writer to do is to think again about what is the story here, and then create a suitable graphic. It doesn't need to look brilliant and beautiful. A little bit of graphic design thought would be nice, but not critical. Don't make it overly complicated, but do make sure that it tells a story, it conveys information really clearly, and has a punchline at the end so that it helps people to understand what the intent is. So they then generally will remember that. And it may even help to enhance the ability to remember all the content that sits around it as well. If it can be the punchline to an entire section, or the kind of the summary of a section, or the lead into a section to provide context. So I think that will be
I
really
love that.
useful for kind of government settings where you're kind of technically restricted.
Yeah.
I think there's that difference between technically restricted with what you can upload and then the actual graphics that you could create.
Yeah, and
And
you know what was really cool, when you were on the panel at APMP, and I know we're on a podcast, so we can't do a demo, but one of the things that you did really well in that panel is that you showed us how in PowerPoint, how easy it was to create some amazing graphics. You didn't have to be this, formal graphic designer. And you were using a tool in PowerPoint to then translate that over to Word. So how could what advice would you give somebody to get started with understanding how to just do those basic tips and tricks in PowerPoint without, of course, showing it? Do you have any advice for our listeners there? Because that was really powerful.
yeah, so I mean, I'm a big fan of using whatever tools you have available. I think that often people will look at, some of the really kind of cool and funky programs that people use. Even something like Illustrator or After Effects or Photoshop kind of from the Adobe suite, which are
Yep.
fantastically complicated and brilliant, allow you to create lots of graphics. A lot of kind of large companies will have graphics teams and they'll use all of those, and it's just the mind boggles at that. Or you look at kind of full HTML5 type development for truly kind of web page based interactive type graphics as well. And again, it's beyond the skill and the budget of most people, including me. It's not something that you do, but everybody
Great
has
if you're trained in
PowerPoint.
that.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can do it, fantastic. But then there's also a time issue. Do you have the time to be able to do it?
Right.
So, but if you can, I mean, great. Don't stop doing it. That's fantastic. But for most people, they will have somewhat simpler tools. Things like PowerPoint is probably the most ubiquitous tool out there, and you're finding more and more people are using it not just for presentations, but for print work and for layout. And it's not really designed for that, but it's often the best tool that people have available. And it's, if you figure out how to use it, it can be pretty good. Again, I go back to the previous point of try not to make it too complex.
Yeah.
So think about your story, think about what you want to achieve. It doesn't have to look the best in the world. Set a style up front, stick to it, and consistency is going to be your friend there as well, because then everything looks considered. And so you can use, I use PowerPoint, but you can use simple things like Keynote as well. If you have an Apple, it'll pretty much come with it. It's the same kind of graphics package, really. Simplistic tool, but it allows you to create some pretty cool things. And you can take it further. So you mentioned before about the restrictions on federal type stuff and government proposal. Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. But if you then get into the corporate world, you can start to do more interesting things. Actually, you can create entire proposals using PowerPoint if you wanted to. It's not the best text editor in the world, but you can start to create some more interesting diagrams in it. You can start to use animation potentially. And so that can maybe make it, again, that bit more engaging. I'm not talking about things flying all over the place unnecessarily. I'm talking about pacing the flow of information, maybe using a little bit of motion if it's going to be moving across a map type sequence or across a process diagram, or helping people to understand. You can start to embed things like video. You can start to embed audio, again, if it's appropriate. And you can also start to create more navigable experience as well. So there's two functions in PowerPoint. One is called hyperlinks and one is called triggers. Of course, you'll all have heard of hyperlinks, but you can add them really easily in PowerPoint. And triggers are a way of being able to, trigger something to happen on a slide when you click on another object. So you can start to create things that feel like actually quite an impressive, quite a slick multimedia experience just using PowerPoint. But then, of course, you got it in a PowerPoint kind of tool set, and that maybe is a problem because you don't want to share a PowerPoint file. But there's there's a great company called iSpring, so the letter I and then Spring. And so iSpring is a plugin for PowerPoint that allows you to convert your PowerPoint file into HTML5. And so now all of a sudden you can put it on any website you want, send people a link to it, and now they've got the ability to kind of navigate through it on the web. It can feel really slick, it can feel really cool, and it's a very easy way to essentially create a little microsite. So now each of your proposals can be there, but you don't have to go through the coding and the programming that you would normally do to have to create a website. So I mean, if you're familiar with PowerPoint and you can use a few graphics and things, then I think that works really nicely. But also, you know, you can take your PowerPoint, create an infographic in it, and you can save it as a PDF, or you can save it as an image and then insert that into a more traditional, probably word-based proposal, which is what a lot of people do.
Yeah, and you know, it was interesting because I was shocked at what is possible in PowerPoint. And so I really want the listeners to hear that. Like he's got so many, he just said a whole lot in that brief little statement there. There's so much that you can do with it in, you know, for the full bells and whistles of PowerPoint and for a presentation and or a corporate proposal or whatever. But, you know, for those of you listening, like go play around with it just to learn some subtle little ways to create basic graphics that you can then transfer over into Word, because Word's got some graphic potential too. How do you feel about what the capabilities are within Word?
So, I mean, it's all part of the same Office suite, so
Yep.
things are kind of compatible across. There's very few people that I know that will try to create graphics in Word just because
Yeah.
it really isn't built for it. It's very good at kind of document elements and styles and kind of overflow text and all of that kind of stuff is great. But the ability to create graphics, I mean, I'm sure if you've ever tried, you create a line and then you create another line, and the first line that you put in there has now disappeared, or it's jumped onto the
Oh, it's
first
horrible.
page, or it's all over the place. So I mean, my preference would be build any graphic you want to. If you're going to use the Office suite, I mean, clearly if you've got Illustrator or something, it's probably better to do it in that.
Sure.
But if you're using the Office suite, PowerPoint is a really good tool to create graphics and charts and things, and then you can select them all, group them together, and either bring them over to Word if you want to, or just save it out as an image and bring it over to Word. And that's probably a better workflow, and most people that I would come across do that. And if you want, shameless plug alert, everybody, if you go to brightcarbon.com for all your presentation related needs and services, you can also check out the free masterclasses that we've got. So, I mean, that's kind of a genuinely useful thing, I think. So every Thursday, we've got these 30-minute masterclasses that are free that go through a lot of the things that Lisa described that I shared at the APMP kind of gathering. So different tips and techniques on how to create the graphics, how to format things, how to do things really quickly as well, because I've got loads of spare time, said no proposal professional ever kind of thing.
Right.
So doing it quickly is going to be useful. And again, I think we'll probably talk about other resources too, but there are lots of tools out there for you and resources and things to be able to help you. So if you've not used it before, don't just open up PowerPoint and expect magic to happen. It's a pretty dumb program. You've got to lower yourself to its level to make it work. But then when you do, actually, it can really come alive.
Yeah, and I would really encourage my listeners to go out and do that. Go out to BrightCarbon and check out their master classes, because it really was. I was so impressed. Like I said, I keep saying over and over, the APMP conference, just because I was like blown away. Like, holy cow! I had no idea PowerPoint could do that. Very simplistically, yes, you had to show us how to do it, and if you're doing that in a free masterclass, that's brilliant. So I encourage you all to go out there, because, you know, the other thing is that probably very few people that are listening to this right now are graphic design professionals.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have Illustrator, they don't have Photoshop, they're, you know, and they don't have time, right? They don't have a ton of time. So they're trying to plug stuff in. And, you know, as you know, I think both of us see very few companies using graphics as powerfully as they could in their proposal responses. And even in, you know, from a presentation standpoint, for a best and final presentation, or having to go into finalist presentations, I see presentations that people put together and they're crap too. Like, you know, people are just not using that. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's because they're scared of it, or they just don't know how to use the graphics?
I imagine it's maybe a combination of the two. I suspect there's one element of, well, everybody does that. Everybody, you know, in a presentation world puts up lots of text and bullet points and stuff. And so there's kind of, you know, safety in the herd of everybody doing that. Trying to change what you're doing is sometimes hard, but trying to change other people's responses to it is really tricky as well. And so I think there's a wealth of resources. I mean, just loyal listeners will know that, all of the people that you're interviewing and the things that you're bringing to the table, Lisa, are phenomenal in terms of the resources that are out there, and the things that people are willing to share is great. And outside of this as well, a quick Google search every now and then will net you some really useful resources. And then it's about putting those into practice for yourself, but also figuring out ways that you can bring your colleagues along with you, because I suspect that's going to be the biggest barrier. There's a little bit of fear of change,
True.
not only in you as an individual, but as everybody else. So, I mean, just listen to half a dozen of your podcasts alone, and you'll find kind of great things. But that's also the thing. Don't try to overdo it, because it could be completely overwhelming. Just pick up on 3 or 4 things that are going to be really useful for you, and then build on that kind of as you go.
Yeah, I like that approach, right? Build on it as you go. And I'll tell you, almost always when I'm dealing with my clients, they want better graphics. They know they need better graphics. That's one thing that I think a lot of the team members would embrace if they just knew how to do it, right? And again, to your point early in the conversation, is you got to do it right. You got to do it well. You've got to put a visual out there for the right reasons, not just to slap something up in the proposal.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. In terms of creating the graphic itself, I mentioned before about creating kind of elegant storytelling sequences and creating things like infographics in a way that convey the story. But if you are faced with a traditional proposal, a 3-page PDF full of text from a subject matter expert, for example, it can be hard.
Ugh.
Again, shameless plug alert, everyone. I hope this is okay.
Yes.
But one of the things that we have at BrightCarbon on the resources section of our website is a step-by-step guide that takes you through how to visualize. And so it's
I
a
love
process
that.
we think tends to work generally pretty well. Again, as with all of these things, it is not the only way to do it, but it is a way to do it that generally gives us good results. And the essence of it is looking at your content and trying to break it down into the individual elements in that content that you could consider to be represented by an icon, a graphic, some kind of individual small visual. So things like objects or people or places, that kind of thing can work really nicely. And when you've got all of those inside your head, you then need to try to bring them together. So is there a scene that you can use that will allow you to convey all of those different things together? So often that's going to be some kind of base diagram. So things like a process flow, or a chart if it's lots of data points, or a map, or you're building out kind of a 2D or even 3D world, and kind of things like mind maps as well allow you to connect all of these things together. And then when you've got all of your individual pieces connected together, and sometimes it's not possible to do it in one diagram, sometimes it has to be 2 or 3, you then think, right, are there things that need to change in that diagram, across those individual elements that allow you to tell the story? So do things have to move around? Do things have to kind of change color to emphasize them and highlight them? Do they need to show some kind of change by getting larger or smaller? Do they need to disappear completely? Do things need to come in a certain order? So this is starting to go more into the realm of kind of the pitch proposal, kind of the presentation at the end.
Yeah.
I think if you're creating kind of more of the dynamic type proposal where you can put it on the web, then maybe that's suitable. Or you can use PowerPoint even to do this and turn it into a video and embed that in your proposal as well, which can work nicely.
Ooh, that's
So you start to think about how some of these things might change over time. And if you do have to do it in print, or you do have to do it in just standard Word, maybe you do like a before and after kind of diagram. So 2 things stacked next to each other or stacked on top of each other. And so now you can see clearly the differences, and maybe you're pointing those out. And then the final piece is, once you've kind of told the individual elements in the story there, what is the punchline? And again, it's something I mentioned before, but it's so important that the graphic is not there just to kind of look pretty or add some visual interest. Yes, it can do a lot of the storytelling, but if it's vaguely complicated, then that's a problem. So put in a nice, clear and obvious punchline about what you're going to get. So the benefits, the
Mm.
outcome, the value to you, or why this is a problem, why this is a challenge, and why you need to do something about it. Or this is kind of what it is and why it means something to you, to provide context and relevance to the rest of the content that you're putting in there. And I think that kind of process of the individual elements, the scene, the ways that they may change over time to tell the story, and the punchline are really kind of key to be able to bring that out. As I said, if you check out the resources section of the website, you'll see that, and it kind of goes into a bit more detail on it, and it's got some of examples for you. But I think that kind of thing might be useful if you're in that situation where you're just stuck and you've no idea. Often people don't need it. Often they just need the confidence to say, hey, I'm going to put a graphic in here because it will work really well, rather than a wall of text.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you showed us that document, that visualization document.
Yeah,
at APMP, and it's really great. So you guys, I again encourage you to go out there, and these are free resources that he's sharing. So definitely get out there. I love that you use the terminology punchline, because I think that really resonates with people, and that can really help people understand that that's what that visual needs to do for us. We've got to have that punchline to it in the end. The other thing you talk a whole lot about is infographics. So I want to circle back to that, because you've mentioned it a couple of times. What do you mean by infographic? I think we can all in our heads make an educated guess, but let's hear your viewpoint there. And when is it appropriate to include an infographic?
So, Lisa, you've used a very dangerous term there, which is my viewpoint on infographics, because I'm going to get a little bit opinionated here. So I'm sorry.
Good.
I think so. It's a phrase that you hear all the time. But if you do just like a Google image search for infographic, what you'll probably get is, in the first page even, is probably a lot of icons with a lot of text underneath it. And I think that's misleading. To me, an infographic is a true visual story. So often it's going to be relatively large. Often it's going to be a half page, a full page kind of piece. Everything needs to connect together. A very good example of an infographic is something like the water cycle, where you can see kind of the entire ecosystem, if you like, of the seas and the rivers and the groundwater and the transpiration from plants, and you've got all the trees there, and you've got the clouds in the sky, and you've got precipitation coming down across mountains and stuff. And so you can see this entire ecosystem in a single graph or single chart or graphic, and then you have annotations and labels and things over the top of that to show you what's happening in each of those different areas and what the overall cycle is kind of water around that system. That is a really good example of an infographic, because it very elegantly displays kind of quite a complex set of information and all the different things that link together. And I think that's where an infographic can really work well, if all these things kind of link together nicely. And you also look at an infographic and you say, well, a lot of times people, again, just put an icon and a lot of text. But now let's think about using that graphic to convey information. So a nice example that I like to use is, let's say there are 3 billion internet users around the world. What does that mean? Is that maybe sounds impressive, but is that a big number? And so you say, well, if you just put the number up there, and again, a lot of people just put big text on a slide and think that's an infographic. Not really, because I don't know what it means. So if I were to say 3 billion internet users, and I have like a small picture of a internet globe type thing, and then I put it against an actual picture of the world, a full world map, and I say, but there are 7 billion people in the world, and you have those two individual graphics at kind of proportional sizes, now you see that the internet usage is about half of the world population. So all of a sudden, it feels really small.
Yeah.
But if you were to take that same graphic of the internet kind of world type thing and put that against, the US flag, and say there are 3 billion global internet users, which is kind of 10 times more than the population of the US, all of a sudden that feels like a really big number. So I mean, you've got to be careful a little bit, because you can lead people. You want to be leading people in the right direction, but we've all got a bit of an agenda there. So if you're using the graphics in the right way, and that example is relatively simple, it's just using icons and text, but now we're using the relative sizes to convey meaning with it. So I don't know if that's kind of useful, particularly over a podcast, to listen to, but I think that use of an elegant system to convey lots of information in a kind of a full story, or to be able to convey maybe even fairly short points, very quick points, very quickly and very elegantly works really nicely. And those, I think, are the components of an infographic. And you can blend other bits, and you can blend those pieces together to be able to create something. But I think that's really useful. And it should be able
Yeah.
to replace a large body of text and maybe not need very much text explanation kind of around it.
Well, and I think something that you did there was because as soon as you started talking about the water system, right, and the trees and the stream, and I could visualize that, and I'm thinking I might be interested in learning about that if it's in an infographic in that way. But if you paid me $10,000 to read about it, I don't care, right? I don't want to read about that process. Yuck, boring. But how fun to see it in the visual. And I think for our listeners out there thinking from a commonsensical standpoint, your readers don't want to be bored either. So how can you convey that in a visual that helps them see it better? And I think, wouldn't you say too, Richard, that helps them understand better how it's going to feel to work with you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a huge amount there in terms of how a graphic can compel people to kind of pay attention, to actively engage them, as you say, because it's much more interesting to them. But it also gives them a much clearer understanding of what's involved. And as you say, it probably reflects really nicely on you as an individual, you as a company too, because now we're getting back into the realm of the nice graphics and stuff you have on the title page. Actually, if that level of professionalism can go into your storytelling and your conveyance of information as well, then fantastic. And it's a really clear indicator that this is a switched on team, a switched on company that kind of knows what's going on. I mean, the nice thing about it is it's not always immediately obvious. It feels so much better. There are so many instances that we've come across where you get the results back from the procurement team, and they say, that was one of the best proposals, one of the best kind of presentations that we've seen. So let's not undo it here. Sometimes they lose. Sometimes it's the feedback is, look, really sorry, we can't give this to you, but that was a really good proposal. That was really good, kind of presentation. And the reason they lose is sometimes it's often price. You're great, absolutely, but you're 4 times more expensive than your competitor, and we simply can't square it. And there's no value judgment that you can make with it for some of them. Other times they are a lot more expensive, and you can clearly demonstrate the value. In some instances, it's that was really great, and what stood you apart was the presentation because we could see it. And other times it's just they win, and you don't really understand why.
Right.
It's not entirely due to the graphics, clearly, but I think that it will play a big part in that because, as you pointed out, there's that connection there, as well as the ability to kind of engage with it, to understand it, and really be persuaded by the punchlines that you can put in, the graphics, helping people to understand what's going on.
That's fantastic. So much fantastic information, Richard. As always, I knew it was going to be a wealth of information. Tell our listeners how they can learn more about you and what BrightCarbon does. I mean, obviously, you've already given us some great resources on BrightCarbon, brightcarbon.com. So I want you to tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, but also what sorts of things can they hire you guys to do aside from the free resources that you've given on your website.
So lovely opportunity to another shameless plug there. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Just before we get into the shameless plug, some other things that folks might find. So as I said, I'm all about kind of people being able to help themselves. So BrightCarbon is a great tool, but there are lots of others. So if you want images, go to things like pexels.com and unsplash.com, which is a brilliant resource for
love Unsplash.
Loads of beautiful imagery that you can use really very nicely. If you want icons, things like illustrio.com and the Noun Project are again great sources for lots of different styles of icons, and you can use those kinds of things to create the graphics that you want to, and these are all free sites. If you want to spend a little bit of money, then there's a really good site called creativemarket.com. And that is a market of lots of creative people where you can get some images and some icons, but you can get lots of illustrations and graphics as well. And so, for example, you spend $20 or $30 and you'll get a library of several thousand icons. And so if you choose that one, then everything is consistent and kind of nice and stylistic. it's not a huge investment. It's probably worth it. And then some of you may know of Mike Parkinson, for example, with Billion Dollar Graphics. Again, another great kind of company, a great guy to be able to share lots of cool free stuff. And again, if you check out his website, billiondollargraphics.com, you'll find lots of really cool things there. But again, lots of other resources. And he's building a really cool tool at the moment to be able to create a lot of stuff if you want to as well, which is kind of neat. So, I mean, as I said, some of the guests that you've had, Lisa, and other people out there are really keen on sharing and helping and just, help the community, which is great. If you do want anything professionally done by BrightCarbon, then we can do presentations and infographics and stuff for you, and e-learning and interactive things. And if you check out the website, brightcarbon.com, you'll see in the top left services, and you can go down and you can have a look or get in touch, and we're really happy to chat and geek out. But really, it's about being able to share and do cool stuff. So if you want to learn more about what you could do, check out the masterclasses that we mentioned before, and I think they're really cool. And if this is your first time on the podcast, hello, welcome. But check out some of the back catalog as well, because there's some really cool things that you'll learn just from this podcast series alone. So maybe that's the good first step.
Awesome, Richard. Thank you so much. Thank you for that shameless plug for the podcast. We appreciate it.
I mean it though. I mean, it's all, this is it. So, and again, if you've not been to the APMP kind of community elements, the individual chapter events or the national one every year as well. Again, it's another great community for proposal writers and professionals in that kind of space. And so I think kind of building on your own abilities, using some of that is really good. And then maybe you seek professional help after that.
Yeah, I love that too. And APMP, for anybody that doesn't know, is Association of Professional Proposal Management Professionals. I know I keep tossing that acronym around. Definitely check that out. And we are, this is the whole purpose of the podcast, is to give people access, because I think we can kind of get in this tunnel of head down, work on the proposals and just our own little world. The purpose of this is to expand our horizons and give our listeners teachings and resources as powerful as BrightCarbon and so many of the others that you gave us. So this has been really, really great. I so appreciate you being here. It has been a pleasure, and I'm sure that this is not the last time our listeners are going to hear from you, because I'll probably be tapping into you again in 2019. So thanks for being here.
Anytime you like. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. It's been delightful.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, you have been listening to the RFP Success Show. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And as always, we appreciate your reviews. Until next time, signing off.